Good evening, good morrow, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Studio Lounge. You'll notice by the magnanimous aura of sexiness hanging here that we've got a hell of a guest. Welcome, brother.
Thank you, brother, for having me in today, and I look forward to the conversation as always.
You were your conversations with you always leave me asking questions, both of myself and of the world around me. My favorite levels of existential dread.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We gotta ask them. So I'm doing something right then.
So today, what I want to talk about, what I want to pick that magical mind of yours on, emanates on what I think is a real problem plaguing our, I wouldn't just say the next generation, but I would say our society, because it's affecting all levels of it. And that's the loss of an attention span and the relationship between the teacher and the learner. Because right now, short form content is huge. But
Mhm.
in my experience, long-term learning has a lot greater value and is required for those for success later. So first to you is, how do you think as a society we're like, what direction are we headed in based off of this shift in how we're approaching knowledge?
I was watching a movie the other day called Flight with Denzel Washington, and he's an airplane pilot. And the plane crashes, but he's able to, do some maneuvers to preserve a certain amount of life from the crash. While they were going down, the nose of the plane was straight down towards the ground. They were in a nose spin, I think a nose dive. And from my finite perspective, I feel like that we're currently in a nosedive and we need to collectively pull up on the gear or do whatever it takes to come out of that nosedive.
Mm, that's a really interesting analogy to compare it with. It certainly feels like that because everything's like, it's almost free fall, right? But it's almost like everything's moving so fast we can't tell we're actually falling.
Right.
It- have you watched the movie Don't Look Up on Netflix?
Yes, 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 yes.
This movie does a really good job, in my opinion, kind of encapsulating what feels like is something we really have to compete with, and not just misinformation, but people's inability to discern what is truth, what is
Mhm.
real.
Yeah. Yeah, everything is microwaved times 10 at this point. I think my generation was the microwave generation. And as you can see, that was a while ago. So now we're I was speaking to a person this morning, and they have a lot of hardships in their life going on. And they describe it as, I'm just running full speed ahead. I don't know what's going on, like no time to just stop and reflect on what's happening. And I think with social media, the way that it's evolved at this point, everything is instant gratification, everything in terms of real research um, is almost, it seems to be almost non-existent. Like if I want to research something, I'm gonna just go to a YouTube clip, not even necessarily a whole video, a YouTube clip, and now I'm an expert on this subject matter. And that's, to me, is the biggest danger, because if we're a reflection of the society in which we live, the governments of our societies are composed of people that live in those societies. So, on a larger scale, imagine this kind of research being done when deciding who's a national enemy or when deciding anything in regards to the good of the people. And to me, that's when it really becomes alarming.
To what extent does the pursuit of self-discipline and self-management influence one's inclination to control others or to change their external environment?
I think that people start off with trying to first control their environment before they actually try to control themselves or discipline themselves. Um, Again, it's just my finite view. It may be the other way, but it seems to me when I look around, say social media, the television, all of these things are meant to influence me. I have a product. If I'm a seller, I have a product, and now I'm trying to influence you to buy it. I'm not trying to influence myself to buy it. I'm making it. We have this society where it seems that materialism, meaning what you have, is what is most important. And people tend to go and try to get it one way or the other, even if it means moving other people out of the way forcibly. Again, it's about controlling the environment. We want to conquer our environment. They say that this corresponds with the very first chakra on our,
That primal self.
yeah, self-preservation. I think that's where we start. And then as we proceed upward, as we grow, we realize, like Stephen Covey identified in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, before you have a public victory, oftentimes there first has to be a private victory. There has to be something within yourself that you've reconciled. I look at it in terms of agreements, because where does money come from? They come from agreements between either the consumer and the producer, or 2 corporations. Money, or power in general. Money is just it's a 3-dimensional representation of power, really.
Right.
Power comes through agreements. And until we have internal agreement with ourselves, they're calling it shadow work, I believe, until you reconcile, your external environment with your internal environment. Right. And be comfortable in who you are. You're always going to seek to manipulate other people. You're going to always seek to manipulate other circumstances. So I think it goes hand in hand. It's definitely a moment for self-discovery for the person that's trying to get what they want.
Well, I think I like the way that you described that, because it opens up a lot of possibility for positive reflection about where we go and because we make a lot of decisions. Not to totally take a shit on our societal approach to things. We have elected to value things that previous generations never did. They could not afford to value certain things, especially when you look at relationships and why people are coming together and why they stay together. There's a lot more strategy involved that doesn't connect from that primal sense, but comes from a more of an intellectual, like, I can't afford it by myself, so let's share in, like there's a lot more logic, it feels, that is driving people towards comfort and convenience rather than a primal need.
I think when you say the word primal, of course it reminds me of primitive, right? And and to your point, evolving into an intellectual society, we tend to use the word primitive. Like if you hear it in a sentence and they say, oh, that's primitive, it's almost like saying that it's inferior, right? But primitive or primal or prime is the original state. It's what we're trying to get back to.
Right.
So it's kind of difficult to get there with the mindset that it's inferior.
Right.
And once we get there, because the primal, or the first instinct, before we were named our names, before we emerged from the womb, our original states, one might even say before we even took on form, our original primal states is the strongest state. It's going to overpower intellectualism every time. If it didn't, the jails wouldn't be full with people who know it's wrong to kill people. But in that moment, I was in such a rage. And that's what we have to look inside and seek to tame within ourselves, because it will randomly come out and, for lack of better phraseology, fuck shit up.
But I feel like that's the best phrase to use for what happens when you try to separate something which in its own right was created whole. People, so here's where we get into a certain kind of ethical dilemma as far as how are people pursuing different levels of self-discipline, different levels of self-mastery, because it's easy to ask questions, but it's very hard to sit still. Ironically, one of the very first things we ever talked about was the incredible difficulty required to sit still for just 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes. Just sit still and not twitch or not move. And that's very difficult. How do we repair that attention process once it's getting sucked into that? What can we do to protect ourselves or defend ourselves from inherently being guided into a niche or an ideology or a thought process that if we would have taken the time to think about or approach slowly, maybe we wouldn't have arrived at?
That's a great question. Where do we start? I think everything starts literally in terms of going down the proverbial rabbit hole of whatever ideology. It starts with an impulse, maybe endorphin rush, maybe you're very excited about the subject matter, and over a period of doing it again and again, it becomes habitual. It's second nature. So literally there has to be a reprogramming of oneself in a sense. And the best way I can think of, it's kind of like with smoking cigarettes. You just have to stop and go through the withdrawals. Not even just go through them. You have to really observe what is happening,
Go into
when
them.
that urge comes. Because typically what would have happened is that the urge will come and you will automatically act upon it without even thinking twice. Now that is there, it doesn't have that outlet. That energy doesn't have an outlet. Now we need to be able to transmute or to change that energy, build it into our attention, maybe read something or go and work on the project you've been working on for a while. Redirection is what they call it when kids flip out. Instead of whooping them like in my day, they do redirection. So you need to redirect that energy. And, unfortunately, it's not a whole lot of publicly accredited places for people to learn that, which means they come back to the internet in search of the information. So, again, like you mentioned before we started down this thread, just having the ability to sit still for 15 minutes, no matter what comes up, and just let go and realize that the world is going to go on if you don't get up right now and grab your phone and put your face in it. I think, at least that's a small victory that can be built upon.
I think that's exciting. That's manageable, especially when we're talking about, take advantage of the small victories. Don't fret over the big losses.
Exactly. And I did want to point out, of course, they don't give me no check, but in the case of TikTok, which I think is particularly infectious in terms of social media, I was happy to see that there is a feature in the settings where you can set your screen time. So for me, my screen time is an hour a day. After an hour, I go and redirect. You know what I mean? And I also have it set for that I'm not on it after 11 p.m. At 11 p.m., a box pops up and says, time to go to bed. You hit OK. It don't shut you out. So you still are on the hook to use your willpower to turn it off. But it reminds you, hey, you said you was going to do this. Going back to agreements, an agreement with yourself. All power comes from agreement. Every time that you do what you told yourself you was going to do, you become a bit stronger.
You become a bit stronger. I really like that. So to a certain degree, there's a benefit that we could capitalize on if we can redirect our collective community's ADHD into the right hyperfixation. We could make probably tremendous cultural community changes in regards to how we, because that the world can see, like, it's like all of our eyes are connected now. I'm not saying that there isn't bad shit that doesn't, that happens that nobody knows about. Of course, that's going to occur, but right now it's getting much harder. Every day, it gets harder and harder for a crime to be committed and it not to be seen publicly.
Yes.
This makes everybody accountable, because if you saw a video and you're now responsible for that information. But I would almost argue that on a collective level, it's a great risk for damnation, in the proverbial sense of if we fail to make the right decisions fast enough, because of how quickly an exponential rise can occur.
Yeah, I think the author that I'm thinking of, Peter Sanger, I think his name is. I bought one of his books recently, and again, I bought it because the premise of the book, I think there was a famine going on at the time that he wrote it. I think it's called Affluence and Famine. And he basically he theorizes that if there is a group that is giving aid to the people who are experiencing the famine, and you don't give them money, and there's a famine, and you're not doing anything else to try to eradicate the famine, but it's this group, this reputable group that is doing something, and you don't help, then you are ethically evil. Now, if we stretch that societally, over a period of years, if we use that same criteria, we've been evil in this country for a long time because there's always world calamities that we know about, others that you and I might not know about, but our government knows about,
Right.
complicit,
Right.
and nothing is done to change it. You know, I don't really know if we should take that kind of accountability because it's that kind of there's a section that will say, well, these things happen because it's ordained to happen. You know, some people look at it that way, but I do know that if I was in a famine and my infrastructure was destroyed around me, and I know that there is in the rest of the world, there's the means by which people could help me, I would want it. You know what I mean? And it kind of goes back to the whole do unto others as you will have them do unto you kind of idea. I think that everyone should have the ability to not only express an opinion, but also have everyone understand that it's an opinion. And, you know, you might not agree with the opinion, but, you know, at least hear it out, at least, you know, ruminate on it for a bit before you just shut it down based on your preconceived notion of the person making the opinion. But I don't think there should be any restrictions on someone making an opinion. Yeah.
Do you think maybe it's not that we shouldn't, an opinion is like assholes everybody has when they all stink. Maybe it's more a statement, right? A ruling, a declaration, a law.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a it's about having the point of like separating a fact from an opinion.
Mhm.
What is because if we don't have an objective way to determine truth for everybody, we then end up in a subjective liminal space where something is true for some, isn't true for others, and it becomes very difficult to get everybody to agree.
True, true. But there's really what would be an objective standard in terms of values and beliefs, you know? Of course, maybe we can all agree that people shouldn't kill each other.
Right.
Maybe we could all agree that people shouldn't rob each other or whatever. You know, we could create a list,
Right.
you know. But then it becomes tricky because we're measuring the act as which is tangible instead of the motivation which is internal to the person and is much more complex. It might result in somebody dying. It might result in something else that's undesirable. And after a while, as we've learned, we'll be legislating everything.
You're right. So this is a segue that kind of transitions well back to this question of do we need religion? Because the root of a religion is what?
You mean the Latin root?
Sure. Or we'll take the connotation. Like when you hear the word religion, what's the first thing that in your mind just jumps up?
Me
Yeah.
personally?
Yeah.
Control. I
Control.
think
Yeah.
of
Okay. So,
control.
so I would have suggested rules, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So similarly, I'm like, okay, I think you're in the right. I think you're in the right space. Because so, what did you when we talked about this originally? Right? The idea of where you begin to like the value of money comes from a relationship and an
Mhm,
agreement,
mhm.
right? I'm not going to do that, or I'm going to do this work for you, and it's an exchange of power. So the
Right,
way that we make these steps is through a relationship. I would argue that religion is just it's the same. That it's about a relationship with the people around you, with the world around you to create harmony. Like in Freemasonry, we testify that there is harmony is the strength of our institution.
correct. Yeah, yeah.
And so what's the most harmonious system you know?
The most harmonious, I would have to say Sanatana Dharma to me is the most harmonious system.
So what is that? I'm unaware of that. I'm unfamiliar to the term.
We call it Hinduism, right?
Okay.
Yeah, we call it Hinduism, but it's known as Sanatana Dharma, the eternal way, right? Is what it roughly translates into. And what I found is that there's not really, I mean, it does have dogma depending if you're a Vaishnava or a follower of Shiva or what have you. They do have rules, don't get me wrong. But it seems to me that everyone has an opinion and
Right.
everyone's opinion is valid. You know what I mean? As opposed to you got to pray this way at this time. It's like, no, you know, it's not that intense. We believe in one God, and it's a myriad of different forms that this one God takes, and this one God may talk to you this way.
Right.
So if there's an objectivity, is that the one God is the objectiveness in it, if you would.
Right.
But how that one God communicates with you in particular is a whole different ball game, as opposed to having somebody that's a high priest sit over you and tell you we need your atonement offering today, kind of thing.
Right. Right. No, so I like that a lot. And that's something that I think has been a pervading difference between religion and spirituality. I think the
Mhm,
individual requires spirituality to be able to reconcile the
mhm.
religion and the differences that their point faces with all of the other points. But I
Yes.
do think that religion is a requirement for people, whether that's the objective religion of whatever is determined by the society. But I think we have to have the rules. We have to have the agreement because, like, there are points which we can go like, yeah, this is a great, this is a good, but there's always conditions. The exception proves the rule. And there's always, we agree killing people is bad. But
Mhm.
if somebody's killed a person, then there's, now it's about us. Now it becomes objective. We have to make a determination.
Right.
I would, I guess my follow-up question, and I'll wrap it up soon, is if you were to read something, what would determine the validity of that truth?
Uh, and it's going to sound selfish, I say, but when I read something, the validity in it is, or I determine if it's valid or not, if it's something that's, I guess it goes back to the objectively true. If I read a sentence that says, if you walk off a cliff, you're going to fall to your death, I'm like, yeah, that's gravity. Gravity doesn't really care. That's really what's going to happen, right?
Right.
Um, it's something that I can demonstrate. And also, not only just demonstrate, because there are things that I believe that I wouldn't necessarily say are true. It's just what
Okay.
I believe, right?
Okay.
But in terms of truth and validity, it's something that not only works for me, but it also works for a certain segment of others as well. So it's
Right.
not just me having a hallucination; other
Right.
people are also having the same experience.
I like that. So my challenge for you in this space, because this is one where, and this is like student to master here. This is something I need your definitive help with, especially with as much as you have read, as versed as you are in the different texts and tomes. The Quran is a text, especially with the original Arabic.
Mm,
It's very hard to break. It's very hard to find a flaw, especially in the language. And you're like, well, if God were to have written something, I feel like it would come out lyrically perfect. It would come
yes.
out, like you take what is something that would, with Shakespeare, it's like, okay, there's four lyrical devices in one statement. You read one line, and you're like, how the hell did you fit 40? It kind of has these vibes where you're like, when did you say this book was written again? Or how the hell did he know that? And just
Yeah.
information that you're just like
Yeah.
with every sacred text, there's something you'll read and you're like, how'd you do that? How did that get there? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any experience with the Quran? Have you ever read it?
Yes. Yes, the Quran is very, as you said, it's one of, if not the most beautiful piece of literature that I've read in English. I haven't read it in Arabic, but I've heard it spoken, but it sounds like a song.
Yeah.
It makes, I used to make rap songs, taking parts of it because of how it sound, you know what I mean? So I say that to say, um, I heard it said that the Victorian era, which was in the 1800s, not that far ago, it's nearly impossible for people today to really understand how they processed reality just 200 years ago. If we take that and then say back to the 1400 years ago in the desert, no phones, no computers, no, you know what I mean, no electricity, no, it's very hard to get into that mind state of how Prophet Muhammad was able to do what he did, or become a receptacle for
Right.
the true criterion.
Right.
I don't think we're in a place today where we can really understand that unless we take on similar austerities.
Ooh. Ooh. I like that, especially because that mirrors what I would say is the pilgrimage path of the modern Gnostic Christian,
Mm,
right? You want the knowledge of Christ, you got to walk like Christ, and that is very hard. Like that's
You sure that's what you want to do?
Yeah, you sure that's what you want to do? Yeah, I mean, there is oh God, it just, ladies and gentlemen, as our video decides to cut out because of my cheap ass and the inability to buy a proper subscription, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for tuning in. This is one crazy cracker and a far more intelligent brother. Thank you so much for joining me.
You must be kind, brother. Thanks for having me.